Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Welcome to another episode of Rock and Read. Today I'm very excited to announce that we will begin reading a brand new book for the Rock and Read series on my channel. This book is about my favorite female vocalist of all time, the one-of-a-kind wild woman of rock, Janis Joplin. We're going to be reading from this book every other week, go back and forth between this book and the Rocks book by Joe Perry. Then once we get done with the Rocks book, we'll move on to something else. This book was written by Holly George Warren. It's called Janis, Her Life in Music. Here's a good shot of the cover. This book actually came out really recently. Just last year. I suspect it'll be new to most of you. Most of you probably haven't read this book before, myself included. This is my first time reading through it too, so we'll find out together what happens as we go along. Why don't we start out with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is called Pioneer Stock. There's a quote at the top which says, "Don't write what you are doing, write what you are thinking, Seth Joplin." With that, here we go. Janis Joplin came from a long line of risk-takers, 17th and 18th century pilgrims, pioneers, preachers, Revolutionary War and Civil War soldiers, sodbusters, cowboys, ranchers, and farmers. Both her father's and mother's families date back to America's early arrivals from England, Scotland, and Sweden, landing in New England and Virginia. Branches of the family survived shipwrecks, kidnapping by Indians in the French and Indian War, and wagon treks across the continent. "I'm from pioneer stock," Janis would boast to friends who worried about her drinking and drug-taking. Perhaps she was thinking of the ancestral great-grandmother whom Janis's sister Laura would later describe in her memoir, Love Janis, a tough pioneer woman, stout of body and strong of heart, whose inner convictions and faith in her husband carried her across the frontier. If Janis looked deeper, she also might have traced her ambition and restless spirit to her forebears. Her parents met on a blind date. In December 1932, in the midst of the Great Depression, 19-year-old college student Dorothy East went out with engineering school dropout Seth Joplin, 22, in their hometown of Amarillo, Texas. Like their hard-scrabbling ancestors, Dorothy and Seth would stake out uncharted territory, the American middle class where they hoped to earn a living with their minds rather than with their hands, and safely pass on their upwardly mobile aspirations to their children, though in markedly different ways. Dorothy East, the eldest of four, grew up in the trauma of her parents' troubled marriage, a fraught union begun in tiny Clay Center on the Nebraska plains. Settling as ranchers in the newly minted state of Oklahoma, Cecil and Laura Hanson East gave birth to Dorothy Bonita on February 13, 1913. But missing her large farming family back in Nebraska, Laura insisted they return to Clay Center, where Cecil started a hog farm in 1920. Disease wiped out his stock, and the East went bankrupt and moved in with the Hansons, where Laura re-immersed herself in their fundamentalist Christianity. Cecil struck out alone for wild Texas boomtown Amarillo and became a real estate agent, a heavy drinker, and a philanderer. The East reunited in Amarillo when Dorothy was a high school senior, but the marriage was broken. Decades later, Dorothy remained haunted by her parents' horrible verbal abuse and violent arguments, her enraged mother sometimes attempting to hitchhike back to Nebraska without Dorothy or her younger siblings, Gerald, Barbara, and Mildred. While Dorothy tended the children, Cecil would drive out, retrieve his wife, and bring her home. Word spread around Amarillo about their marital problems and Cecil's kerosene, which shamed Dorothy, who vowed to have a congenial marriage and never invite small-town gossip. One refuge she sought was music. Dorothy started singing in church as a child, and by all accounts she had a beautiful voice. In Amarillo, she joined her school's lyric club and participated in light opera musicals. The Amarillo Globe-News singled her out in a review of the operetta Once in a Blue Moon. Dorothy East, as the Moon Lady, was worthy of the praise bestowed upon her from all sides during and following her parts. Her aplomb was excellent and outstanding. Dorothy sang at weddings, Lion Club events, and in local musical productions. "I always had the lead," she told her children later. My lungs were so good and my pitch so true. In that great big auditorium, I could hit high notes and low notes that would reach the last row. But it didn't affect my ego any. I didn't think I was the best in town or anything. Still, she harbored the desire to sing professionally. Her father encouraged Dorothy's musical pursuits, while her mother, who'd lost most of her hearing during a childhood illness, did not. After one Lions Club performance in 1931, the local paper noted that, judging from the applause, she was a regular sensation, with Dorothy being hailed as the second Moran Talley, a teenage coloratura soprano plucked from Kansas City, Missouri to join the New York Metropolitan Opera. Eventually, a New York production man, Dorothy recounted, got me aside and said, "If you want to go to New York, I can get you in a show with no trouble at all." But Laura East discouraged her daughter, advising her, according to Dorothy, to go to business college because you can learn some skills you need to earn a living. The talent scout admitted that show business was tough and not your kind of people. The New York idea tapped into Dorothy's fears of continuing the chaotic cycle of her parents' lives. It would be an itinerant and insecure life, possibly even bringing disrepute. Dorothy wanted more control than that. Using her vocal talent in a traditionally responsible way, she applied for and won a music scholarship to Texas Christian University as recommended by her pastor. She was home for a Christmas vacation freshman year when she met Seth, the son of Sebe Joplin, a stockyard manager and former cowboy and sheriff who had grown up on a West Texas ranch, the eldest of 11 children. Sebe's grandfather, Benjamin Joplin, helped build the U.S. Cavalry's original Fort Worth, one of the outposts constructed after the Mexican-American War. Seth's mother, Florence Porter Joplin, ran a boarding house on the outskirts of Amarillo. A native Texan like her husband, Sebe, Florence was the youngest daughter of 13 children whose father, Robert Porter, had been a purchasing agent for the Confederacy. Sebe and Florence's first child was a daughter, Margaret, followed by Seth Ward Joplin, born on May 19, 1910. Margaret attended boarding school while Seth lived alone in a one-room cabin behind the boarding house away from the roughneck lodgers. A solitary boy, he lived a spare existence, immersing himself in books. He enrolled at Texas A&M College for 2 years and then transferred to the University of Alabama to study mechanical engineering. With little money and no help from his father, who had quit school at 13, Seth dropped out a few credits shy of graduating and returned to Amarillo. When Dorothy met him, he was living with his parents at the boarding house and pumping gas at a service station. Seth and Dorothy made an arresting couple. He, a handsome young man with thoughtful, deep-set blue eyes. She, an attractive, vivacious, green-eyed college girl. Yet, at the same time, they were opposites. He, a brooding introvert and would-be intellectual who preferred quiet evenings discussing literature and philosophy. She, an outgoing flapper who loved playing piano, singing, and dancing all night. Dorothy was devoted to her mother's Christian beliefs. Seth was an avowed atheist. In good times, one could say they complemented each other. In bad, they were perhaps destined for discord. They had in common a passion for music, a desire for a better life, a fierce willfulness, and stoicism. They would give all these qualities, except the stoicism, to their daughter. When Dorothy returned to college, the sweethearts corresponded. In the intimacy of letters, Seth, in a move uncommon for a man of that time and place, expressed a desire to know his girlfriend's inner self. Dorothy recalled with some surprise, "He once wrote me, 'Don't write what you are doing, write what you are thinking.'" There's the quote again. It took me rather aback, because any previous correspondence I had was to parents who certainly did want to know what I was doing. This inquisitiveness about the life of the mind, as well as a talent for expression through correspondence in the written language, would also surface in their eldest child. After her summer break in 1933, Dorothy opted not to return to school. Perhaps still hoping to become a performer, she helped out at Amarillo radio station KGNC, but she was soon fired for inadvertently cursing into a hot mic. "I can't figure the thing out." She prospered, however, at a Montgomery Ward store, where her knack for business led to a promotion from temporary summer help to head of the credit department. Well-groomed and always fashion-conscious, despite limited funds, she designed and sewed her own eye-catching dresses and accessorized her dark bobbed hair with jaunty hats. She poured her creativity into dressmaking, a pastime and talent she'd pursue throughout her life. Though Seth didn't prefer nights out dancing, he did enjoy alcohol and occasionally smoking cannabis, legal in Texas until 1937. During Prohibition, he taught himself how to make beer and bathtub gin, which he'd sometimes share with Dorothy's father Cecil to his teetotaling wife Horace Chargan. As for Dorothy's vices, she took up smoking at a time when cigarettes were marketed to women in advertisements as torches of freedom. In 1935, Amarillo, amid the Dust Bowl in the northwestern plains of the Texas Panhandle, had about a 25% unemployment rate. A college friend advised Seth that the Texas company, later renamed Texaco, was hiring in Port Arthur in the southeast corner of the state. The subtropical city on the Gulf Coast had the world's largest oil refinery network, a sprawling complex crowded with smokestacks spewing fiery chemical plumes into the air. This thriving industry made the Great Depression seem non-existent. So Seth packed his belongings and drove nearly 700 miles to Port Arthur, where he hated the humidity, mosquitoes, and refinery exhaust. But the friend who recommended him had been correct. The growing city and its largest employer, the Texas Company, offered a man like Seth the chance to earn a decent living and work indoors. He would indeed do better than his parents had. Impressed with his intellect and engineering skills, the Texas Company hired Seth as a manager overseeing the construction of metal containers used for shipping petroleum around the world. There is no suggestion that Seth particularly enjoyed or found great satisfaction in his work, yet he certainly did appreciate the security of a management position for a man of his background. And he gained a sense of importance, especially during World War II. He would receive 3 draft deferments on account of his expertise at America's sole manufacturer of oil shipping containers. He would work at Texaco for the next 40 years. Port Arthur is 100% oil, is how a 1932 geology book described one of the 3 towns, comprising the Golden Triangle, a man-made canal linked Port Arthur to Beaumont, surrounded by oil fields, and Orange, home to Consolidated Steel. On January 10, 1901, Texas oil was first discovered at Spindletop, 4 miles south of Beaumont and 15 miles north of Port Arthur. The legendary oil well began with a roar, shaking the ground under the derrick, spewing first mud, then rocks, then 6 tons of 4-inch pipe out of the ground, hurling it into the air like soda straws, according to Texas historian Lon Taylor. Then, a 150-foot plume of oil erupted, and it spouted 100,000 barrels a day for 9 days before drillers could cap it. Spindletop marked the beginning of the modern petroleum industry. Texas and the world would never be the same. Port Arthur's origins actually predated the discovery of oil. 5 years earlier, it was founded and named by self-made railroad tycoon and visionary Arthur Stilwell, who built the city along with his newly constructed rail line that originated in Kansas City. 90 miles east of Houston and 20 miles from Louisiana, Port Arthur was situated on the shore of Lake Sabine. The eccentric Stilwell wrote later that his hunches for choosing the town's location came from mystical brownies, or spirit counselors, who whispered to him in his sleep. In 1898, Stilwell financed the arduous completion of the 7-mile canal, modeled on Egypt's Suez Canal, connecting Port Arthur to the Gulf of Mexico. He built a grain elevator and a port, with a British ship transporting to Europe the produce that had traveled by train from the Midwest. But the next year, Stilwell's Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf Railroad Company went bankrupt, and Port Arthur's development fell to John W. Gates, a shrewd Gilded Age entrepreneur who originally helped finance Stilwell, only to then oust him from their partnership. A barbed wire magnate later bought out by U.S. Steel. Gates' nickname was Bet a Million, the result of a prodigious gambling habit. Among the bets that paid off were his financing numerous oil wells near Spindletop, his founding the Texas Company, and his purchasing the Port Arthur Canal and Dock Company. He built a major refinery and public buildings, including St. Mary Hospital and Port Arthur College. Gates remained the town's primary benefactor until his death in 1911. When Seth arrived nearly 25 years later, Port Arthur was bustling with oil refineries, chemical plants, and shipyards, its canal and port busily shipping petroleum. The population had increased to 51,000, with an influx of refinery workers from across the state and Louisiana, including French-speaking Acadians or Cajuns, as well as African Americans and Latinos. From 1930 to 1935, East Texas oil fields had created the state's great family fortunes. Brian Burrow reported in his History of Texas Oil, The Big Rich, At the time that Seth became an employee, the Texas company, the most brash and aggressive of the companies, had refocused its operations, de-emphasizing exploration in favor of refining and marketing. Soon after signing on, Seth sent for Dorothy, who quickly found a job at Port Arthur's Sears Roebuck in the credit department. The young couple's goal of settling down, raising a family, and rising to the middle class was underway. On October 20th, 1936, Seth, 26, and Dorothy, 23, married, with no relatives making the journey east to attend. On nights out, the newlyweds partied at the boisterous roadhouses that dotted Highway 90 across the Sabine River in Vinton, Louisiana. Years later, Dorothy recalled dancing on tabletops at the same clubs where her teenage daughter would herself raise hell. The Joplins spent the first 7 years of their marriage industriously saving money for the future. One June day, 6 months after the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor catapulted the United States into World War II, Seth came home from work and told his wife, "Let's do something for posterity." According to Dorothy, 37 weeks later, Janis Lynn Joplin was born at 9:30 in the morning on January 19, 1943 at St. Mary Hospital. 21 days early, she was 18 inches long and weighed only 5 pounds 6 ounces, but was healthy. After her birth, which he didn't attend, this businesslike Seth, 32, personally typed his 29-year-old wife a wry memorandum. "I wish to tender my congratulations on the anniversary of your successful completion of your production quota for the 9 months ending January 19, 1943. I realize that you passed through a period of inflation such as you had never before known. Yet, in spite of this, you met your goal by your supreme effort during the early hours of January 19th, a good 3 weeks ahead of schedule." The new parents cherished their baby, whose every milestone was documented by Seth's camera. Janis would be the center of their world, a spotlight that she had always craved, for the next 6 years, until their second child came along. Seth, though by nature a shy man with a dark outlook on life, would treat his firstborn like the son he had hoped for. Dorothy wanted for her daughter the perfect, respectable wife she'd never enjoyed as a girl, devoted herself to full-time mothering. She planned to bestow on her child every opportunity to make her a success. And baby Janis's easygoing temperament helped inspire the new parents with the faith that they would succeed. She never was cranky or cross or troublesome, Dorothy recounted. Janis began crawling at 6 months and standing when less than a year old. Her blue eyes would light up when her father came home from work. As a toddler, she began a ritual of meeting him at the front door. After dinner, Seth settled into his easy chair to read a book or listen to Bach and Beethoven, his eyes sometimes welling up from the beauty of it all. He was very different from most Port Arthur dads. Janis considered her father a secret intellectual. She said later, describing him as a book reader, a talker, a thinker. "He was very important to me because he made me think. He's the reason I am like I am." Her independent streak certainly came from Seth, but although she'd rarely admit it, Janis was equally her mother's daughter, absorbing Dorothy's fascination with fashion, her intense desire for control, and of course, a powerful singing voice that offered a way out of a staid, restrictive life. Although Dorothy had turned that down, Janis would not. About 4 years earlier, in 1939, the Joplins had taken a major step toward their goal of a middle-class life. They left their rental downtown on 6th Street for their first home, a larger 2-bedroom brick house at 4048 Proctor, Port Arthur's Main Street, with enough room for Dorothy's mother and her youngest sister Mildred to live with them. The East had finally divorced, with Cecil relocating to Kansas City and cutting off communication with his children. "If I'd had a choice about which parent I kept in touch with, it would have been him," Dorothy later said of her freewheeling father. "But he physically and emotionally divorced himself from all of us." Laura and Mildred East stayed with the Joplins for 7 years until Janis was 3 and the war ended. Still devoted to her mother's faith, Dorothy joined the evangelical First Christian Church, a branch of their Nebraska denomination. As for Seth, he hadn't been brought up in a family that was religious, Dorothy said. That man didn't belong to anything in his life. The Joplin's youngest child, Michael, remembered Mom asking Pop if he wanted to go to church. He always said no. I asked him why once, and the gist was he didn't believe in God. He believed in spirituality, but not organized religion. He didn't like the preaching. Seth stayed home every Sunday, while Dorothy and Janis, and eventually siblings Laura and Michael, went to the service. As with his passions for classical music and literature, Seth did not overtly express his atheism outside the Joplin home. To be an out atheist was to risk harsh judgment, even shame, from the deeply devout Port Arthur community. Only those close to him knew and accepted, and even admired, Seth's convictions. Among that small group was his eldest child, Janis. Nevertheless, at Dorothy's insistence, Janis was baptized at age 10 by immersion at the First Christian Church on Proctor Street. She would attend services there through junior high. 30 years later, Janis's paint-by-number Jesus Praying at Gethsemane would be discovered in a church closet. Like her mother, Janis first sang publicly in the church choir, and Dorothy taught her in Sunday school. Seth did not object to any of it. The dichotomy between her parents' beliefs and their mutual respect became young Janis Joplin's normal. As a child, Janis displayed her father's restless inquisitiveness. She was always curious about everything, according to Dorothy, and if she asked a question, I answered it straightforwardly, even if it was embarrassing. She was probably hyperactive, although I didn't know it. I thought she was just intensely interested in what she was doing. I didn't know that was something you could attempt to control. On the back of a photo of a visit to Seth's family in Amarillo, where the rambunctious Janis was allowed to run wild, Dorothy noted that Janis had lamented to her parents, "We are going home now. I'll have to be good." In Port Arthur, appearances mattered. Dorothy, increasingly status-conscious, wanted a genteel, proper middle-class daughter. She dressed little Janis in home-sewn playsuits and ruffled frocks, sometimes with gloves and a hat, and much later would teach her to expertly wield a needle and thread. Janis shared her parents' love affair with music. Dorothy purchased a used upright piano and began teaching 4-year-old Janis to play and sing. Seth was proud of his wife's talent and at first encouraged his daughter's efforts. She started on piano lessons to learn scales and keys, Dorothy recalled. I found some wonderful books of children's songs so she could learn to sing, and I could play the primary notes on the piano and she could get the pitch. From my own singing experience, I could help her with the tone and make the sound of a vowel or a consonant correctly. She learned to sing folk songs and started singing them when she went to bed at night. It was absolutely enchanting. Dorothy jotted down on a photo of Janis, sings herself to sleep. As the Joplin's dream of economic security seemed to be coming true, Dorothy suffered a setback. Still in her early 30s, she was found to have a benign tumor on her thyroid gland. During surgery, the doctor irreparably damaged her vocal cords and destroyed her singing voice. Soon after, Seth, a quiet, distant man who had trouble expressing his feelings, demanded they give away the piano. He claimed that Janis's banging on the keys now got on his nerves. He'd have a hard day at the office, and you can imagine what those scales were like to him, Dorothy tried to explain. He said, "We just can't keep the piano." We didn't fuss or quarrel about it. When one of us had a vehement opinion about something, the other would accede to that opinion. So I got rid of the piano. It broke my heart. Perhaps suffering anxiety over her mother's hospitalization, followed by the subsequent loss of music in the house, Janis began sleepwalking. One night, Dorothy found her outside on the sidewalk, seemingly looking for something. When she asked, "Where are you going?" Janis kept saying over and over, "I want to go home." In the coming months, Dorothy suffered 2 miscarriages before giving birth to their second daughter, Laurel Lee Laura Joplin, on March 15, 1949. A colicky baby, Laura cried constantly, demanding much of her mother's attention. 6-year-old Janis learned to fend for herself, or she would seek out her father, who seemed to recognize himself in his daughter, and for a time always welcomed her company. As if she were his son, she'd accompany him to the barber shop, where after Seth's haircut, the barber would trim her bangs. Later that year, the family decided to move to a better neighborhood. The lady who lived on our left was married to a sailor, Dorothy recalled. I don't think she knew any normal words in the English language. She cursed worse than anybody I ever heard in my life. I did not want my children growing up learning that kind of language. The Joplins took the next step up in the class ladder and bought a larger home in Griffin Park, a leafy new subdivision just outside the city limits. They had made it to Port Arthur's version of suburbia. The white frame house at 3130 Lombardy Drive, quite modest by today's standards, featured a generous yard where Janis played. Seth tended a backyard garden, and Dorothy baked pies made from pecans or pecans depending on where you're from, pick from their trees. Janis immediately found friends among plentiful neighborhood kids, with whom she roughhoused on playground equipment built by Seth, and put on plays and puppet shows in a theater he constructed. Since her infancy, the Joplins had frequently photographed Janis, and now they took pictures of the two sisters dressed in identical outfits sewn by Dorothy. Janis would spend Saturdays with her father, visiting the Gates Memorial Public Library, and opposing Greek revival style edifice, Seth's own kind of church. At my house, Janis said proudly, you got a library card as soon as you could write your name. Like her father, she learned to treasure books and showed an early aptitude for reading, recognized soon after she entered first grade at the nearby Tyrrell Elementary School in the fall of 1949. Her parents had done all they could to ready their firstborn to become a popular and high-achieving student in Port Arthur's well-funded school system. Well, that wraps up Chapter 1. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 1 in the comments. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.